So welcome to the IPBA Employment and Immigration Committee webinar of today. The topic would be diversity data, the dilemmas, legal nuances, and the best practice for diversity data collection, analysis, and use. We have almost 80 people, registered today on that webinar. So waiting that everyone is online. Maybe before presenting our stellar panelists, and thank you very much for being there, I can make a few IPBA announcements. The first thing, the big event that's going to come is the conference in Chicago, which will take place between April 23 to April 26, 2025 in Chicago. I know that our president, Michael Shu, is there. Hello, Michael. Thank you very much for organizing that for us. And it's going to be, of course, a great conference. And for those who have not registered yet, please consider doing that as soon as you can for 3 reasons. First, we want Michael to be able to have some sleep. The second thing is that the early bird rate ends on 31st of December. And the third, which is the last but not least, is that the organizing committee has been able to secure a great event for the welcome reception. It's going to be a baseball game, an actual baseball game as in Wrigley Field. And there would be the Cubs playing the Los Angeles Dodgers. And there would be lots of baseball stars playing. Don't ask me, I don't know anything about that, but I've been told that Shohei Ohtani is a great player and will be there, is the kind of a star of the baseball. So if you want to have a chance to get a ticket, that's going to be included in your registration fee, except that if we are too many registrants, it's going to be on the basis of first in, first served. So that's the third reason why you should register as soon as possible. So that's going to be a great event and a great conference, and we will all be really happy to see you there. The second announcement that I wanted to do is on behalf of our chair committee of the Employment and Immigration Committee. That will be the next webinar organized by the committee, and the topic would be on restrictive covenants, and it's going to be moderated by Christine Chen. The date is not really defined solid yet, but it's going to be during the first quarter of 2025. So stay tuned. Of course, you would receive some emails from us regarding that, and we'll be really happy that you are that you would register to that one too. So with no further ado, let us introduce to you the panelists that you will hear from today. We have for Japan, Hiroyuki Kanae from Anderson, Mori, and Tomatsune.
Hi, everybody. Nice to meet you. Good evening, good afternoon.
So Hiroyuki focuses on corporate law, M&A, in addition to labor and employment, and he also advises on real estate and dispute resolution matters. Thank you so much, Hiroyuki, for making time for this.
Thank you.
You're welcome. Nice to talk to you, and also many prestigious speakers and also audience. I'm from Tokyo, and I'm happy to join this webinar. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Hiroyuki. Then we have Simon Goran from Bottle Hatfield in the UK. Hi, Simon.
Hi, everyone. Very nice to meet you all, and pleasure to be on this panel today.
Thank you, Simon. Simon heads up the employment practice and advises on a full range of employment law issues, both contentious and non-contentious, often across European and international jurisdictions. Once again, thank you, Simon.
Pleasure, and thanks for having me. Looking forward to participating.
With pleasure. And we also have Kirsten Lucas, who's originally from England, but he's for the time being working in Dubai, UAE.
And Kirsten heads up the Middle East employment team and has a wealth of experience advising clients across matters under the UAE federal laws, the laws specific to the free zones, including the Dubai International Financial Center and the Abu Dhabi Global Market. She also has a wealth of experience under English law. So thank you so much, Kirsten.
Thank you both very much for that lovely introduction. No pressure to live up to that. And a huge thank you to all the other panelists and the IPBA Employment and Immigration Committee for setting up this panel in the first place and inviting us all to take part.
With pleasure. And last but not least, we have Trent Sutton, who is originally from the US, working partner, with Littler, and who is now based in Singapore.
Yes,
So-
good to be here.
Hi, Trent.
Thank you, Trent. So for everyone, Trent is an international employment attorney. He helps multinational employers navigate and comply with the widely different employment obligations across the world. He uses his experience and Littler's broad international platform and his own extensive network to provide strategic human resource and employment advice on a regional and global scale. Thank you, Trent, and we look forward to hearing from you.
Thank you, Trent.
Wonderful.
And we have Veena Gopalakrishnan from India, who's a partner at Trilego, who's going to be co-moderating that panel today.
Thank you, Fred. And we have the very lovely Fred David, who's a partner at Halle, based out of France, Paris. And Fred and I will be talking to you today about the diversity data collection dilemmas. So thanks, everyone, for joining. So I'll just set a little bit of context before we go into Q&A. And when I was doing a little bit of last-minute prep work, I came across this little quote, which apparently Sherlock is in one of the Sherlock Holmes novels. And it is a little pearl of wisdom. And it says, it's a capital mistake to theorize before one has data. It truly does emphasize the importance of using data to drive smart decisions. So today we see organizations worldwide strive to foster more inclusive and equitable workspaces. And for this purpose, it's become almost a necessity to collect diversity-related data. But reaching out to employees, reaching out to workers, and getting and even resorting to a data-driven approach comes with its own legal issues, ethical dilemmas, and of course, data protection is a very significant part of the conversation. In the next hour, what we really hope to do and hope to chat with our very international panel here is to explore the intricacies of diversity data collection, focusing on the why. Why do we even need to collect diversity data? What is the purpose? The what, which is what kind of diversity data should an organization be collecting, and what kind of diversity data can an organization even collect? And then we go into the how of things. That is, how do you collect? How do you manage it? What are the best practices? What are the legal nuances? And what is the future of diversity data collection? So once again, welcome, and we look forward to tapping into the very international expertise of the panelists here.
So maybe we can, thank you, Veena, for that introduction. Maybe we can begin by the why. And one of the questions we have listed for the why is beginning by how. It's how is diversity data collection linked to broader diversity, equity, and inclusion goals in your region? So I don't know who wants to begin with that one, to take that one first.
Yeah, I think I'll just say it goes back to what Veena suggested. It's impossible to really know how well we're doing in our diversity efforts without collecting data to measure it. We don't know if we're applying, or if we're recruiting appropriately, if we're gathering individuals that are representative of our clients or customers. So, like anything, we've become in our businesses, we sort of study all trends, what our clients are doing, what our competitors are doing, how much we're making, how we're approaching things, how we can do business better. And I think this is just one other thing we track to be sure we're, as a business and as a corporation or company, truly utilizing the benefits that we know we can achieve through appropriately diverse and inclusive work environment.
UK, you wanted to
Yes.
add something again?
I think it's very important to have a diversity inclusion at the workspace. I think that trend, especially for newly hired peoples, recruiters, and also freshmen. Every year in Japan, it's a trend. What kind of company has make better result for the business-wise and also a work environment. So more and more younger people want to have a better and free work environment, especially for acknowledgement of diversity, how the female and also higher positions contributed at the management level. So not always the main controlling company is not a cruel company. So that's why diversity is very important in Japan for the comfortable and also effective and also good performance for the company. That's the key.
Yeah, and I think what you're saying is true all over the world. There has been a lot of studies by Gartner, for example, and they are really linking diversity within companies to the liveliness of or creativity of the work done, and the fact that people would want to stay or join such kind of companies. So it's not only good thinking, it's also something that is proving very important in the results of a company.
Yeah, it is indeed a business prerogative, Fred. And Gustin, go for it.
Yeah, I mean, just to echo some of the other comments made, I think one of the things Trent picked up on, I mean, obviously part of the discussion today is around diversity and equality initiatives, but it's also about just doing business and dealing with what's right in front of you immediately. And I think maybe the UAE is a really wonderful example of that. I mean, this has to be, Dubai in particular, one of the most diverse and multicultural cities on the planet. So diversity is really staring organizations in the face from the very get-go. Now, on the one hand, you've got such a rich tapestry of different cultures, different perspectives, and different talents. That just is a breeding ground for collaborations and innovation, but it's also a breeding ground for challenges. And how that manifests itself in the workplace is a particular challenge. And just to sort of get a bit of sort of regional context on it as well, I think there is inevitably, across all our jurisdictions, quite a heavy focus on some of the more traditional dimensions like race, gender, and ethnicity. But particularly in the UAE, on a day-to-day basis in the workplace, there's a number of other features that are as prominent, if not more so. I'm talking of things about nationality, differences in language, differences in religion, and differences in cultural background. So I think, yes, I mean, all of us would agree. I think getting diversity data is a cornerstone of managing the effectiveness or implementing any type of DEI initiative, but it's also just about how we actually operate on a day-to-day business.
Thanks, Kirsten. Simon?
Well, thank you very much. I'm not sure I can really add a great deal more than that, apart from echoing what everyone else has said. But I think the other thing that it strikes me that's very important about data gathering, and as I see it, it pretty much underpins all of these other DE&I strategies that we are going to come on and talk to, because fundamentally, without decent data capture, we've got no idea, as Trent says, whether we're doing a good or a bad job in relation to our D&I strategies and initiatives. And as Kirsten said, we've got no idea without that data as to whether we're doing good from a business perspective and a workplace perspective as well. So it's pretty fundamental, not only the cornerstone, but also underpinning all of those strategies. But it's also very good at highlighting where we're doing things wrong or where we need to make improvements. And I guess without that, and this is the legal bit, I guess, that potentially could expose us to some business risk if we don't actually know where our weak spots are in terms of our diversity ecosystem. So without this data capture, and I'm sure we'll come on to talk about how data capture has become more and more relevant, more and more sophisticated, and some of the tips and tricks that we can perhaps give to the audience about some of the things that we're seeing around data capture in our respective regions. Without the data, the rest of it doesn't really hang together. So for me, it seems to me that this is the pretty fundamental linchpin, the building block of DE&I strategies going forward.
I think we've covered it all, and just to summarize on the whys here, I think it really is two-pronged. One is to like what is in this Sherlock Holmes quote, to say you can't really theorize without data, but you can't test the effectiveness of a theory without measuring data. So when you are, whether or not an organization needs to come up with certain policies, practices, resource groups, you will need some data to understand whether it is even relevant, and to test the efficacy of those policies, you will again go back to relying on data. So it is truly a cornerstone of implementing DEI initiatives in that sense. Now, moving to the what of it, and I think the most useful part of this conversation for our audience will really be the how and the best practices and the legal nuances. So I think we all agree on the why. It would be very useful to get a sense of what diversity data is typically collected by organizations in your country. What is it that organizations do collect, can collect, cannot collect? So if you could spend some time on that, and feel free to raise your hand, or just go ahead and unmute and start talking.
When we prepared the panel all together, we just realized that depending on our jurisdictions, there were really some differences on what was really important across the world. So that's one of the, rare occasions where there is really a huge difference. So that would be interesting. Maybe Hiroyuki, you want to begin with that?
Yes, I think especially working environment at the management level, especially for how many female members at the board members or officers, that data is very important. And the government these days initiate to collect those data, and they have to disclose that data for up to, right now it's company with 300 people must report how many female officers, and also the discrepancy between the wage. But next year, I think the government wants to lower that threshold amount, threshold people that 100 or more employees, companies must disclose that kind of data. By doing that, I think the more than 900 companies must report how many female officers and directors, and also there is any discrepancy. It means how many high-ranked officials and officers are managed by female. It means the more and more young people want to be updated and also promoted to the higher position. That's important. So government wants to collect those data? About other jurisdictions?
Yeah.
Dustin, you
Kirsten,
have another?
your hand is up.
Yes, I mean, in my experience, particularly with multinationals, there's no hard and fast rule for the UAE. If they are collecting diversity data, they will be collecting the usual genres of diversity data, with one quite notable exception. You wouldn't see companies collecting data about sexual orientation in this particular region. And there isn't a particular law mandating the publication, like Hira was talking about. But there are almost by default some pieces of data that you need to ask employees for. So with the immigration requirements here, you would need to be asking information about nationality. You'd also need quite a lot of information about educational background and academic qualifications. Again, all things that can be drivers or indicators of social diversity, for example. So there are other requirements sort of buried in the labour law, like the minimum things you have to put into an employment contract under the UAE federal law. Nationality of the employee is one of them. So again, whilst there's not a sort of positive duty to gather that data in one sense, there is in order to comply with another type of obligation.
Yeah, I think if I may, sometimes, when you look, I'm a US licensed lawyer, obviously, and work around the world in a lot of these areas, but, we sort of think what's being collected, we start maybe from what's statutorily required, like was said earlier. And in the US, companies that are subject to the EEO annual filing have to report gender, they have to report race. If they're a federal contractor, they have obligations with regard to minorities in general and covered veterans and individuals with disabilities. So those are the areas that we see most often US-based companies wanting to collect: disability, race, ethnicity, gender, and veteran status. Now, veteran status, when we try to export that outside the US, doesn't make sense. In Korea or Singapore or so many places that have mandatory veteran, everybody has to go do their part. So sometimes, maybe we as a company don't do a very good job of siphoning off what makes sense. And sometimes it doesn't make sense to collect race data in a place that's super homogenous, for example. And so at any event, we still see a lot of these collections on a multi-country basis, including all of these things. But as Kirsten noted, we also often see US-based companies, I'll speak from that perspective, also wanting to collect information about gender identity and sexual orientation, given the state of US law on those two categories. Those are the ones that I see most commonly sort of put on my desk to say, can I collect this? I'm collecting it in the States. How do I collect this same information later? And of course, we'll get into, or somewhere else, of course, as we'll get into, then you have to make a choice. How much of that do you really need to collect outside?
Simon?
Thanks, Fred. Again, echoing what everyone else has said on the panel, I get from a UK perspective, broadly speaking, it sort of splits into two camps. You've got the mandatory sort of information that companies of a certain size, and it's very interesting that I'm sure as this debate progresses, we'll see lots of common themes emerging. One of which already is a threshold requirement, I think, for, as it sounds as if there is in Japan, as there is in the UK, for disclosing publicly certain types of reporting. The threshold in the UK is 250 employees for things like pay equality data. So collecting data around gender is clearly one of those things that a box of, or a bucket of data that larger organizations have to collect. So that we've got mandatory and then we've got voluntary. And voluntary is effectively, there's no mandatory requirement to do it, but we think it's good practice to do so for all the good reasons that we talked about in the last section about why we're collecting the data. And I guess in terms of sort of the data that is broadly being collected, certainly from a mandatory perspective, we're looking at things like gender and disability, potentially age. When we come on to the debate a bit further on, there'll be some other changes coming down the pipeline in the UK, which will mean that things like ethnicity is likely to be a sort of an area of data that will be mandatory to be captured by companies of a certain size. On a voluntary basis, I don't think anything is off limits, but because it's voluntary and because it's typically anonymized, it's very much the user to decide whether or not they want to volunteer that type of data. Picking up on Hiroki's point as well, there's that when we come to talk about listed businesses or companies that are on an exchange, particularly when it comes to board diversity, there's fundamental requirements and obligations for those types of companies in the UK to collect, again, similar types of data that we've talked about, some guidance around a split at board level of males and females, some mandatory guidelines and requirements in relation to disability data and disability policies that need to be provided. So I don't think the UK is certainly not an outlier when it comes to data collection. It's very much probably very similar to the US in terms of the type of data that it's collecting, but broadly speaking, there's two buckets, mandatory and voluntary.
And Kirsten, would you like to add something or?
Yeah, I was just going to say, I mean, it would be very remiss of me not to mention two sort of quite interesting programs here in this context, and which also picks up on something Simon was saying. So on the board quotas, I mean, as far back as 2021, that does feel a long way back these days. The public joint stock companies over here in the UAE that are listed on the Abu Dhabi or the Dubai exchanges are mandated to have at least one female representative on board, and that does have to be reported. So there is sort of a very limited reporting obligation there. The interesting thing with that is it's just been expanded to private joint stock companies. So from January next year, there is going to be a requirement to have a female board member in those privately held companies as well. I would imagine that will need to be something that goes in the director's report, for example, in the annual report each year, details to follow. The other feeding on from what I said about immigration in terms of collecting nationality data is, like many countries in this region, we have a program here for promoting the entry of nationals into the workforce. So in this country, it's called Emiratization. In Saudi, it's called Saudization. So, for example, and so there are not necessarily reporting requirements, but there are legal obligations to comply with in relation to the diversity of your data. So another reason why nationality data collection is particularly important here.
Yeah, and you have lots of choice of nationalities. On the gender pay equality, do you have any obligations in your jurisdictions?
Not a mandatory gender pay equality reporting one for the UAE. There are a lot, actually, when you start looking at this, as I did preparing for this seminar. There are a lot of initiatives. It's important to remember the UAE is still a very young jurisdiction, but it's an incredibly ambitious one and incredibly bold in what it's trying to achieve in terms of its presence on the global stage. So there is a Gender Balance Council, for example, that has a Gender Balance Index. Now that's largely focused at government organisations, really, and that measures not really just equity pay, but how they're dealing generally with gender equity within those government institutions. And they do partner with private institutions as well to try and encourage them to report some data voluntarily as well. But as things stand at the moment, I'm not aware of a positive mandatory duty to report.
Okay.
I see. I have a question to Karsten, especially for Middle Eastern countries, diversity, especially Dubai is a fast runner. But I think that for Japan, still gender diversity at a higher level, especially for board members or officers. I think the government initiative is to increase that number to 30% by the year of 2030. And still a little bit, 5 years ago, it's a little bit far ahead. But how about the some kind of, a goal for that? Already OECD countries, like 30% or more. At the,
definitely. And I think we're aiming for the same percentage. Yeah. So as I said, there's a lot of national initiatives. So Vision 2031 we're on now, I think, for example. So the UAE issues the sort of national programs for how it's going to grow and develop over the forthcoming 10 years. And the latest one is Vision 2031. And a big focus on that is achieving good societal growth in terms of cultural diversity and gender balance. So, and there's a lot of either royal family backed or ruling family backed organizations, sort of impact agencies that have sprung up. One that springs to mind is called Aurora 50, and they're focusing a lot. And I think some of the recent statistics they released, I think we're probably around about 13% on that journey towards 30%. Interestingly, as I mentioned, though, a lot of these initiatives are operated first in the government sector. So, for example, at the Federal National Council, I believe, which is a parliamentary body that debates legislation, for example, that was mandated as far back as 2018 to get to 50-50 male-female. And of the 40 parliamentary seats that are available, 20 of those are indeed held by Emirati women.
Good. Very interesting.
Thank you so much, Hiroyuki, for your question. And that reminds me that I'm not sure I've indicated that to our audience. There is a Q&A picture at the bottom of your screen. Please feel free to click on that and ask a question. And we will relay, we will convey it to our panelists so that you have a proper answer. So you can do that at any time and we will pick it up.
What's it like in France, Fred? I think it would be good to get your perspective here.
Yeah, so in France, basically, there are some data that are very, very sensitive, such as race, religions, political opinions, sexual orientations, and everything. So that could be, and you know, it's a great introduction to the next topic we will get in, which is the how, because all that is pretty sensitive, but that could be asked to your employees. However, it has to be managed on a very proper way, a very cautious way. And this is why, you know, GDPR France is one of the countries who was very, very, very protective with data. For example, when we're talking about that with Trent, we always have oh, that's like that in your country. We're so far apart. So yes, in France, probably because of historical reasons, and that was the same in Germany, we're really at the same level. People are really cautious about what can be done with the data, your personal data and the data of the employees. So that's, I would say, some of the data are really strictly regulated, and that would be the kind of data that I've indicated just now. And apart from that, you could, you know, a part of the sensitive data where you can't force someone to give you an answer to. And when you have the answer to, you need to be very cautious about how you would deal with that and protect them. You can ask any kind of questions, such as what's your favorite food? You know, that's something really, really acceptable in France.
Super. So in India, it's we don't have a reporting obligation in terms of gender pay gap, but we do have anti-discrimination legislations and policies. So there is and also for certain benefits, and you do end up collecting gender data, which is more. We're still living in terms of data collection in the gender binaries of male and female, because there are tax benefits associated with it. There is an equal remuneration perspective, which again is relies on the gender binaries. But you do, and in terms of diversity, I think India is really complex. We have religion, we have caste, we have socioeconomic background, you have various states, and the kind of food we eat, the language we speak, the clothes we wear, our surnames, everything changes perhaps every 100 kilometers, and therefore diversity itself is a very complex subject here. In terms of what is it that organizations collect, we still are a little nervous on putting things out and asking for data. There is a tendency to say, don't ask, don't tell. There is a fear that if I ask you for this information, then is it possible to have a misappropriation or misuse of that data, or a consequent discrimination that arises because somebody tells me what their caste is or what their sexual orientation is. So on sensitive, nuanced concepts, there is still a lot of reluctance. You will see many, many organizations saying, I do not want to know about this information. We will work under the overarching umbrella of meritocracy. That being said, there will be an anti-discrimination policy, which will go on to say that if you do feel that you've been discriminated against, then that's something that the organization will not tolerate, and you have a grievance redressal mechanism. So proactive diversity data collection is still limited. We do see a lot of our multinational clients asking us this question, which is the reason why we are having this webinar, because global organizations are very proactively collecting this data to ensure that their diversity initiatives are measurable. And there is a legal aspect to it, and there is a practical aspect to it. And it's important that we consider both where you are, which state you are, what kind of employees are you working with, what is the sensitivity that is there. All of these will need to be considered before you actually go out there and collect the data. And we will come to this when we are dealing with best practices. And of course, the legal nuances of consent is also something that we will touch upon.
Yeah. Thank you very much, Veena. And you just pre-addressed one of the questions we received. Nishi said, can we have the Indian perspective from Veena? So thank you for that. We also have another question. Maybe Kirsten, you can address that first. This is a question where you're in a society which is a bit conservative, where it's difficult for employees to share data in relation to their sexual and gender identities. Does this tend to have an impact on the DEI initiatives or even the initiation of that at a smaller organization?
Yeah, I mean, that's a difficult question, and I think it feeds into perhaps some of the things we'll come on to look at from a best practice perspective. I think with any type of discussion like this, it's about the sort of intent and purpose with which you start it, and the level of transparency you give to people around why you're maybe asking for that data, what purpose it might be used for. So, for example, a multinational company that has offices within the Middle East region may have LGBTQ plus personnel. It doesn't mean that they won't have initiatives internally that will recognise some of the barriers to them in the workplace in the same way any other sort of nationality, but there will be local, very, very strong local cultural and legal sort of nuances that have to be navigated in how you would manage that process. But I think a lot of this is about how you initiate the discussion with staff. Developing that level of trust is very important from the outset, and that's, in anything we do these days. If this were a webinar on corporate social responsibility or ESG, it's about that transparency and accountability, and it all ties back to trust in sort of why are you asking for this data and what are you going to do with it.
Yeah, and that would be a great transition to the next part of our panel, which is the how, because it's very, very important for people to, as you said, trust the process, giving personal data and very sensitive information. How is it going to be used and how is it going to be protected? For example, in France, you always have to, when you come to sensitive information, sensitive data, which is not all of the data, but you really have to indicate to the people you are asking the question why that is absolutely necessary that they answer that question for people management purpose, for example, when you come to employment. And it has to be a question which is proportionate to the goal you're trying to reach. And the second thing is that the employee should be aware about how the data would be stored, how long, and who would have access to that. So maybe just to begin with, each of you could briefly outline the key legal frameworks in your jurisdiction that governs the collection of diversity data.
I'll
Please,
start because I'm in the US, which means, hey, it's so easy. There's no restrictions. No, I mean, we have some restrictions, but certainly not. There's a number of states that are trying to improve the data privacy rules. We've got California and Utah and a number of other states that have taken steps to try to protect or set standards for the protection of data. We've had long-standing rules, right, about medical information being kept confidential, about social insurance, social security numbers being kept confidential. There's data breach, strenuous data breach notification and penalties under the law, but nothing overarching in terms of federal law that really sort of hits this issue in the same way that your data protection rules apply in the, 100 and whatever countries around the world that have adopted these except us. And so it does make it an easy thing, but that doesn't mean that we don't give thought to it, right? To all the things that you're thinking about, confidentiality, making sure people know that, we are going to anonymize it, explain why they're going to do it, explain what you're going to use it for. These are all from our perspective here, it's a very practical approach that we would use to ensure that people understand why we're collecting it. Primarily because of our super strong anti-discrimination laws and the very significant penalties that can arise when we violate those laws. It's a super, super sensitive topic when we bring up race and gender, all protected categories and strenuously protected and highly and regularly litigated. So in that sense, while we don't have an overarching data privacy rubric, we do have a practical need to ensure that it is kept separate from anything that could be used to make employment decisions, and it's clear that decision makers are not going to have access to that information in terms of specific individuals, and that we have to be very careful, and we'll talk about that later, how we use that information when we get to the navigating gray legal areas. But generally, some of those same things you talked about, Fred, we would want to do it even here, simply to protect ourselves on a broader basis and to encourage voluntary participation.
I understand. I have a question from Shinsi in the audience that I'm just throwing out at all of you, but maybe Trent, you want to pick it up before handing the mic to someone else. It's the consequences of a data breach. What would be the consequences for the employer?
Oh, that's true. If you're the one who has breached if you've got the data and it's been breached, there are numerous rules, and it depends on the state in which you're in, that require you to do certain things, right? And that you've got certain steps to take. You've got to notify the people whose data was breached. You've got to take steps to give them means to protect that data, to know what was breached and how it was breached and why it was breached. All those things come out, and there can be some pretty stiff penalties. If somebody finds that your data is breached, there's penalties under the data breach laws that vary by state. But also people can sue directly and say, you negligently kept my data and now all my financial stuff is ruined and I lost my house, and there's a lot of claims that can arise out of that. So it is a very important area to be aware of.
Who would like to take it on right now? Thanks, Trent.
Yeah.
Yeah, how about the, especially for data breach, GDPR put, huge penalty, like a 4% of worldwide sales. But I think the USA, there is not so much higher penalty, but that kind of penalties you cannot say how much is damages or people will claim. Of course, U.S. is everything is very expensive. So if there is a data breach, I think the people will claim a huge amount of damages, right?
I guess that's a probable trend that the amount of damages could be really huge depending on the damage they can document, I guess.
That's right. That's right. But there is no figures such as GDPR, like a 40%, 4% of
There's
the
there's no
worldwide
ceiling
sales.
yeah.
Yeah, in fact, we did a survey of the cost to organizations for data breaches, and we've seen, as we've seen recent hijacking of people's data or computers, and we've seen obviously a steady increase in the number of data breaches as organized crime and others have become more sophisticated about obtaining data in the wrong way. And we looked at, I was just pulling up a chart I have here at Littler that sort of lists out lost business costs or the cost of the data breach. In 2015, we listed it could be 6.53 million, all the way up to 9.36 million just a few years later. So we're seeing a real trend in costs that's the US average total costs for a data breach. And then of course that goes and can change depending on where you are. But the other key issue that I think the US sometimes we forget is there's class action risk in the US. Like we hear about class action risks and wages and misclassified workers. But if I'm an employer and I'm involved in a data breach that includes the loss or theft of personal information, there's a number of cases that allow individuals to bring a suit on behalf of everybody who lost their data. And that can result in significant damage for the company.
Thanks, Trent. Simon, you wanted to take the mic?
Yeah, thanks, Fred. So I guess from a UK perspective, two broad points really. Just in terms of the sort of data protection regime, which clearly is the sort of the main regime governing the collection of and what you're going to do with and how you're going to store people's data once you've collected it for diversity data purposes. Probably not that dissimilar from what everyone else has said, really. There's economic sanctions that can be imposed at the group level, which we've heard about. There's notification requirements which are onerous. You've got to do that promptly within certain mandatory timeframes. You've got risk of individuals suing businesses individually, probably less of that currently in the UK, but there is a right to do that. And then you've also got reputational risk as well. There's been a number of high-profile big international companies who've unfortunately had data stolen, even from employees who've perhaps left a laptop computer on a train, or have had other unfortunate incidences. So there's the data protection, safeguarding of this data is absolutely crucial, I think, for this particular debate. And again, how do you go about doing that? So broadly speaking, you've got two camps of data. You've got personal data, and then you've got sensitive personal data. Sensitive personal data is the sort of stuff that we're really talking about here, which does have a special protection under GDPR and UK data protection rules as well. I think it's just making sure that people are aware that once this data is collected, and reassuring people, I think to Kirsten's point earlier about trust and engagement, that it is kept safely, it's stored safely, it's only retained for a certain period of time. We're very clear on the business purposes that we're collecting it and using it for to underpin our DE&I strategies. We're not asking for data that is just unnecessary. There's a purpose for it, that sort of thing. So those are that's the broad sort of framework. It's probably not that dissimilar from what everyone else has said here. As I say, I think there's a lot of common trends and themes that will emerge from this debate. So data protection clearly is a key part of the UK and I guess EMEA region, certainly European jurisdiction region in terms of data collection, and that really is the bedrock of the framework in which the data is collected, stored, retained and used.
So Simon, just a follow up there. What kind of diversity data would typically fall within the realms of sensitive personal data in your jurisdiction?
So it would be things like sexual orientation, religion, belief, that sort of stuff, all of which are protected characteristics under UK equality law. You know, the UK equality laws are strong. The scope of protection is wide. And so those sorts of things, yes, you can collect that sort of data. Yes, you can retain that data. Yes, you may even be able to sort of move that data around global organizations as well with consent under sort of appropriate data protection policies and consents given by individuals. So nothing is really off limits. It's just more making sure that you're, and we'll come on to this, I'm sure, when we talk about some more practical tips on how you sort of, it's all very well in theory being able to ask for it, but you know, actually getting it is is the real key, isn't it? How do you go about getting it? And how do you give people trust and confidence that that data is not going to be misused or abused in any way? So none of this is off limits. It's more about just justifying how and why and what you're using the data for.
Thank you. Kirsten, you have your hand up.
I was just smiling to myself because I think we almost go from one extreme to the other with sort of trends. There's very little regulation too, and it may come as a surprise actually to some people that aren't overly familiar with some of the Middle Eastern countries that how regulated this issue is. So again, I mean, I'm in danger of taking up the rest of the panel, so I'm going to keep this very brief. So Veena, you mentioned at the beginning that, you know, there's 4 jurisdictions basically that I advise on now, and that's correct. So in the UAE alone, the vast majority of the UAE is a civil code system under the federal laws. And then there are 2 pockets. So we have a lot of free zones. The Dubai International Financial Free Zone, where my office is based, is a separate common law jurisdiction with its own rules and regulations. And in Abu Dhabi, there is a similar free zone, the Abu Dhabi Global Market, which is another separate common law free zone. So we have these 2 little common law islands with their own sets of rules and regulations. So when it comes to what can you do with data, the first question is usually to ask, well, where is the company established? Because there is a data protection law in the DIFC, there is a data protection law in the ADGM, there is a federal data protection law, and then, of course, we have to consider the extraterritorial effects of things like GDPR. And all of those have the same sort of protections that other members of the panel have talked about. So requirements to report breaches, quite heavy fines, often in the several $100,000 ballpark if you don't do what you're supposed to do under it. It also has categories of sensitive data, which you mentioned earlier, and again, would cover things like health data, biometric data, religious beliefs, etc. So it is quite heavily regulated. If you go more broadly across the GCC, Saudi Arabia has its own personal data protection law now. Qatar's financial center has one as well. So it's actually quite heavily regulated. And there are some quite tricky nuances to sort of not trip yourself up with. So just to give one example, the DIFC data protection law, which draws very heavily on GDPR. So for most multinationals, it's a similar exercise in what you can and can't do. But it has a strictly defined list of other countries that it considers has adequate protections. And so the DIFC, a very small land area within the UAE, does not recognize the broader UAE as an adequate jurisdiction. So technically, if I march data from one side of the street to another, I'm carrying out a data transfer to a jurisdiction that's not adequately protected. So it really is, it just highlights the importance of getting to grips with the local jurisdiction that you're dealing with. Just to pick up on a question that I saw from Vivek, thank you for that, around types of data that's collected. So medical data, just to pick up one point you've mentioned there. Yes, that is something that is collected in the sense that you can't get a visa generally within the UAE unless you pass a medical examination. There are also, sorry, I should have mentioned, as well as those civil laws I mentioned, there's a whole layer of criminal laws that have aspects of data protections in them as well, and private life. So the medical data is collected for the purpose of getting an immigration visa. So, and you will see most contracts say that you must maintain a particular level of health to satisfy the Dubai health authorities, for example, to keep renewing your visa. So there is an element of updating with some of that data, yes.
Thanks for that, Kirsten. I think we're running out of time, but amongst the questions that we put together, I thought one was particularly interesting. Is in jurisdictions where you can collect diversity data, is there any particular kind of data that you usually, and this is for everyone, that where clients often see resistance from employees because of skepticism or concerns about misuse or concerns about discrimination? Anything that is particularly problematic? I mean, we have several in India. So here in India, I would say caste, religion, sexual orientation. When we do see multinational organizations running diversity data collection drives, there is a resistance to say, why do I need to share it? What are you going to do with this data? Is it going to be anonymized? So there is a pushback. Are there any other criteria in your jurisdictions? I'll probably like hear one or two of you on this, yeah.
Yeah, just I mean, except for caste, which doesn't exist here, Vienna, but we would have the same thing here. You know, when we have global companies sending us the questionnaire, they want all of their employees to sign. In France, of course, we have to indicate to them what is highly regulated and what would be okay. And on the highly regulated, employees would never be obliged to answer on the really sensitive data, except that if we explain to them why it is essential for us to have the answer, because otherwise we cannot manage their file or their hiring, then if they don't want to answer, that's going to be a problem for them, because it is essential for us, the employers, but we have to really prove that, because of course, if we're taking action on that, otherwise they could really not answer. And basically the taboo kind of data would be sexual orientation, political beliefs, religion, you know, the fact that you're a member of a union or things, I mean, information like that, that would generally be the, you know, very touchy information.
And what is the stance on criminal history? Because that's something that we collect a lot and very freely and comfortably in India as part of background check. And I know in several jurisdictions there is possibly a right to be forgotten, and that you cannot penalize somebody more than once for the same thing. So if you're going to be restricting employability based on what somebody did probably as a 20-year-old, then how is that going to be considered a misuse of data?
Would
Or
somebody want
discrimination?
to
Anybody?
take that?
Shall I go first? Okay. Why don't I go first on that? Because so I guess the starting point in the UK is you have a difference between a spent and an unspent conviction. There are some rules around all of this sort of stuff. It doesn't typically come out in disclosure. That if you're going through a background checking process, and some of those, there's some sectors and some industries where that's mandatory. For example, if you're dealing with children or vulnerable people, working in financial services, being a lawyer, those sorts of things, then you know, that sort of, as part of that check, there will be some checks around previous criminal records. What's quite interesting is that there's actually a law in the UK around rehabilitating offenders, and actually, when you look at this, and it doesn't come up very often, frankly, but when it does come up, I'm always staggered how pretty powerless that piece of legislation is if you're the victim of someone in that situation, because actually your redress is incredibly limited. So I mean, it's probably an area that needs to be looked at. If I were in power and I were the government, it's probably one of the things that I'd be looking at. But broadly speaking, it is clearly regulated, very much regulated by background checking, which falls outside of the usual sort of background checking, which I'm sure everyone else on the panel is very familiar with. The usual sort of prudent due diligence that you would do with any new hire. That this is in a different category and in a much more sort of higher, more severe category than that.
Yeah, I think that very sensitive, you know, questions, especially for no criminal record. In Japan, I think companies may not ask the employee or ask criminal record, and there is no method to investigate that one. But I think that sometimes in the obtaining the visa, I think that some country requires no criminal record certificate from the police stations. But police stations, especially, they are keen to that sensitive information, so they will not ask. They do not answer that questions for the usual employer, but for obtaining that positions. For example, like European countries, some people will be dispatched to the executive, and they require for visa, like no criminal record certification. Is that normal?
It used to be a
For us,
requirement
yeah.
here. Yeah,
Yeah.
there was a police certificate that had to be obtained. I think that's been dispensed with now. I mean, just generally on criminal record information, it would fall within the categories of sensitive personal data under any one of those laws that I mentioned, and that would generally require express consent to gather that information in the first place. And I mean, just on sort of gathering data and reluctance generally, it's quite a polarizing issue here. I mean, I'm sort of one of those people, perhaps my life isn't as exciting or fruity enough for people to be that interested in rooting around in it, but I don't mind that I kind of accept that my data is being processed in ways I have no idea about. But a lot of people, and a lot of the younger generations actually feel very passionately about that, very strongly object to the thought of their data being taken. So that may explain, particularly here as well, where I guess the country is sort of on its beginnings of its journey, of its data protection journey. Consent is still a major requirement under the civil laws and under the criminal laws for processing any type of personal data.
Super. So, thank you everyone for like being around post time. We're going to use like just extend it by a little bit to hear maybe a little bit on best practices in terms of diversity data collection from everyone, and yeah, just requesting you all to stay on if you can, and just leverage the expertise and all the intelligence of this very international panel here. So best practices in terms of diversity data collection in your jurisdictions, please. Anybody, Twenty, would you like to start?
And I just think I'd like to set the stage a little bit here because, you know, we saw diversity, equity, and inclusion, which we now refer to, and many of us refer it as to inclusion, equity, and diversity at the end, you know, has been around a long time. We had in the United States, when George Floyd died at the hands of a police officer, it created race riots, and there was immense focus on racial inequality again. And we saw in 2020 people hiring chief diversity officers, and this big focus on diversity and how to overcome these barriers for minority engagement. But that has changed. We've seen now the Trump administration, and we've seen companies, you've seen billionaires, very famous billionaires coming out and saying, you know, DEI is racist. And you've got other companies, most companies saying, no, it fits an important sort of tool to achieve, like we talked about at the beginning, finding true diversity and trying to measure it. So the US, we've seen noticeable, like a plunge. Nobody's hiring, I'm not saying nobody, but we're not hiring chief diversity officers anymore. We're not putting it in the forefront anymore. What happens is we've got in the US a lot of cases saying the same thing, you know, what steps can a company take to encourage the promotion of women or underrepresented minorities without discriminating against men and the majorities? And that's where the battles are right now in the United States. What's the upshot of that is The basic answer is that IND programs that directly or indirectly require us to consider race or whatever the category is, they're subject to liability in the United States now. So numerous courts have actually sided with employees who've raised these issues. We saw the Supreme Court last year sort of knock down affirmative action in universities, consideration of race essentially at all, when trying to engage student body or select students. So as a result, there's been sort of what's happening now is sort of IE&D is becoming more invisible, or maybe I'll say less visible in terms of being something that's actively promoted on the front page, but still companies are doing it. So the question, I think it becomes very important now, is to how you do it. And it's kind of what, the crux of this discussion is how do you gather this information in a way, how do you make decisions in a way that doesn't directly or indirectly mean I'm discriminating against people who are not minorities or who are men.
Thanks, Trent. And I think it's the conversation between that we often hear as positive discrimination, affirmative action. Is it causing an impact on the majorities and the other people who have possibly had a historical advantage, but is that reason to discriminate at this point in time? I think we have a question here, which is perhaps on the lines of anonymization of at the time of data collection. And though this is in the context of a university collecting information, which is accessed by a core team and then anonymized. What if any of you could share some insights on anonymization? And I've personally seen some fantastic tools where data is anonymized at the word go. No human is free from error and prejudice and bias, and therefore it's best left. And even probably machines are not free from it these days, but it's perhaps best to anonymize data up front. But I'd like to hear your thoughts on this.
I mean, I have some degree of skepticism about whether you can truly anonymize a lot of data. Just taking the name out, for example, doesn't mean you can't tell who wrote it. But I think, look, again, it goes back to some of the things we were talking about earlier around trust, transparency, and accountability. It's how, with that particular question, it's what ground rules have you set at the beginning? What have you told people is going to be done with their data? Is it going to be anonymized? Who is in the core team? What is that core team going to use that data for? I think as long as you stick to those rules of engagement, the problems that you create for yourself are when you then stray outside of it. And somebody says, well, I now want all the unanonymized data. Or, your classic, you send something to a CEO and he sends it to the rest of the board, for example. It goes outside the group for which it was originally collected. That's where issues arise.
And it also depends, like you said, on the size of the data set. If I'm collecting data from 20 employees, it's possibly very, very identifiable without the names and without other characteristics. Any other best practices in this space? We'll just conclude. Sorry, Kirsten, did I cut you?
I was just going to say, I really wanted to ask Trent a question. I was sort of, so fascinated to hear about almost the complete reversal of the approach to DEI that he's seeing and how that might play out in the workplace, because certainly one of the things we see here, I mentioned, a lot of the issues we often see in the workplace in the UAE are stemmed from religious differences or cultural background differences. And there's a big education piece. So again, it's like, that diversity agenda is very much at the forefront at the moment. People have questions, what can and can't I do in the workplace? And I was just wondering how Trent thinks that might sort of play out in the workplaces in the States if those discussions are almost being driven underground.
Yeah, it's an interesting thing. So and now we've got the Trump administration coming in. And as you know, during Trump's first 4 years, his group really spearheaded this anti-woke movement, which sort of fomented a lot of this anti-DEI approach. And he passed an executive order saying you can't train people on racial inequality, you can't talk about some of these things that have happened in the past. I'm saying it in a very broad way, and others who support that will say, maybe it's not quite that way, but at a broad level, it was essentially a desire to kind of curb some of what was perceived as unfairness in the approach against the majority and sort of blaming the majority for where the minorities are right now. So we suspect that moving forward with the Trump administration, that we'll see extra scrutiny on companies who are using DEI. So what does that mean for companies? It means they're going to have to be careful for the next 4 years. On the other hand, states and municipalities like New York and others continue to take steps towards DEI, sort of almost as the other side to what the federal is doing. They're the ones passing pay equity rules. They're the ones passing, can't discriminate against people because of their hair and all of these things. So we're going to see this continue sort of approach, sort of dual sort of feeling in the United States. I think one interesting thing is what we're not seeing is metrics. Like if you have metrics, that's something that can be shown a court, and they say they're actively monitoring how many white people versus LGBTQ are in their community, and they're hiring for that. So we're trying to figure out, can we, if it looks like a quota and smells like a quota, then it probably is a rose by any other name is still a rose. So we're being very careful about how we use the data or how we set goals. We're collecting the data, but we have to be careful about how we set those goals. And we used to give management, bonuses for achieving certain diversity things. We're not seeing those anymore, right? We don't want those anymore. And we're also cloaking some of our DEI data reviews in privilege. So at Littler, we're doing a lot of pay equity and other things under the cloak of a lawyer reviewing it, not a vendor, because we don't want that data getting out into a litigation situation, so that we can maintain the advice about how do we do and what can we do with this data to improve some of our approach legally and still attain the diversity sort of that we're reaching. But what's interesting is, Littler just did a survey recently to say, what are companies doing? And we're finding that they're not backing away from diversity, equity, and inclusion programs. They're still doing it. The C-suite, HR, they still are saying this is a focus for us, but how we do it is going to have to change. So that, and then I'll stop talking just by making that last point is, when you look at the data that you are collecting, we're looking at hiring results. We're looking at, employee experience. We're looking at focus groups, which is big in the United States, and how active are they, and do they feel supported? Finding ways to support people along the journey rather than looking at ways to meet certain quotas. And what does that mean? Well, I'm looking at numbers. So it's a very nuanced, it's going to be nuanced, especially for the next 4 years.
And do you think, Trent, that there's going to be an impact if it's a US parent company, a US group of companies abroad? Do you think there's going to be an impact like we had with SOX, for example? Or is it going to be contained to the US?
That's a really good question.
But the question we had is from the audience, anonymous person, so I don't know who it is, but the question is really, will it have an impact abroad in the group of companies, or do you think that what you're describing would only be located in the US and the subsidiaries of the US parent company would be able to continue to navigate with the DI as they were doing before?
Yeah, it's a good question, because in some ways people might be thinking, we're still seeing support for it in the headquarters. So my sense is that the headquarters will be sensitive for US workers, but look for ways to continue to support it outside the US, but probably not as strongly as they've done in the past, especially because there's so much back and forth and we're so interconnected. I think we may see less aggressive tactics, but still
Yeah.
effort.
And I'm assuming this anti-DEI approach is building based on litigation currently, and it's not really a statutory, it's an approach rather than or just a trend that is building.
Well, it's come with
It's
statutes,
more than that.
legislations, rules, Florida passing, you can't, anti-woke laws or statutes and regulations saying you can't train people on that theory of race that white people, or this or that. Those are all been
So it's backed
challenged.
by,
Oh,
wow.
yeah. Some states, so I'm talking red states, right? I'm talking some states within the red states,
Yeah.
but the conservative Republicans, it's a very important issue. It's a very keenly felt. We weren't part of what happened and we're being blamed for that. And why are we being made to be embarrassed? And why are we being made to be and feel ashamed of what happened in the past? And the other side is saying, we've dealt with 200 years of shame because of our experience and our minority status. So it's only fair that it comes back around. That's not necessarily what they're saying, but that's what both sides are sort of feeling. And so you see it play out in regulations. You see it played out with governor administrative orders and executive orders from states. So it is going to continue to be hotly contested, and we'll see how the Trump administration manages that. I suspect it'll be a bit volatile.
Fabulous. I think we need part 2 of this webinar.
Yeah. In a year.
Yeah.
A quick thoughts, Kirsten and Simon, and then we probably have to wrap. And thank
After
you
you,
so much
Kirsten.
for everyone who's staying back. Like 15 minutes.
I was just going to say what an interesting issue what Trent has just been talking to us about raises. So it's such a classic cross-border issue. If you're now operating in the US where you can't gather this data, for example, if you had operations here onshore in the UAE and you got involved in a labor dispute, they're very, very documentary heavy. There's no live evidence in an onshore labor dispute. It's all on the document. So if you didn't have those metrics, you wouldn't be able to defend a case. So that's going to create a real sort of shift, I think, in how things are dealt with. Really interesting.
And I do want to say, I'm not saying we're not collecting it. Everybody's collecting it. Yeah, it's just how we just have to be careful about what we're saying about how we use it.
Yeah.
Just from a UK, I mean, I think all of that is absolutely fascinating, and it will be really interesting to see how that trend, to the extent it develops, and it sounds as if it's likely to, how it will impact all the other jurisdictions on the panel and beyond as well. I mean, interestingly, from a UK perspective, I'm not sure we're quite seeing that yet. What we are in fact seeing with a new change of administration is a focus on more pay transparency. So, for example, what have we got likely to come in the pipeline? Not a rule yet, but has been announced that it's likely to become a rule, which is mandatory ethnicity and disability pay reporting, again, for those that are over 250 in terms of number of staff. So we've actually got more pay regulation coming. And then secondly, from a financial services industry perspective, more DE&I initiatives in the pipeline as well, which would be more comprehensive than what we've got already. So actually, we're sort of now, whether that will be reversed, it remains to be seen. But as it stands at the moment, we're actually sort of going against what appears to be the trend now in the US, so it'll be interesting to see whether that trend is influenced by the general direction of travel in the US, because we've got stuff that's sort of almost ready to move forward. Although interestingly, the government picked ethnicity and disability pay reporting over other aspects of a sort of a menu of things that were proposed. So whether I don't know whether that is indicative of a general feeling as to where this debate is going, or whether it's more of a question of time and wanting to make a bit of an immediate impact. Who knows? But it'll be interesting to see whether all of those trends that Trent has so eloquently talked about, whether they will have an impact on the rest of our jurisdictions.
Well, and I can put a point on that.
Matter of time, I guess. Yeah, go ahead.
I can put a point on that. I just had this happen last month, where a European company who has operations globally, asked me to come and train their managers on inclusion, equity, and diversity. which I did. I've done a lot of those trainings, but then we had immediate pushback from the US team saying, oh, can we do that? Should I go to that training? Like, it was a very awkward sort of moment, which it was like, well, of course you want a lawyer doing that training, so we say it the right way and nuance it the right way, but that puts the point on exactly what you're saying.
I think it's a matter of time, but for India, at least, it's a matter of a long time. It's going to take us a long time before we actually start thinking about the anti-DEI approach, because again, there are so many facets that we are working with. And yeah, I think this is a topic that we should probably do a part B, a part 2 to this conversation. But thank you so much, Fred. Any closing thoughts?
Not on my side. I mean, I'm totally subscribe to what you say. Just to not let the question of Aradhana flying. We still have one more question to address. We just scratched the surface. You did, Kirsten, with the fact that across the street you have another jurisdiction. But Aradhana's question is. What if you have to transfer data to another jurisdiction, and in that jurisdiction it's considered as sensitive or taboo? So do you have any thoughts on that?
My gut reaction to that would be, firstly, was it data you were legally allowed to collect in the country in which you collected it? Did you comply with any requirements there? So that would be your sort of first hurdle to get over. Your second hurdle would be if you're even allowed to transfer data to the country that you're transferring it to. Have you got the right rules and regulations in place? Is it an adequate jurisdiction in terms of protection? I think they would be the two focus areas for me. I think, if you're talking about delivering it to a server, so it's just held in another country, it's very much going to depend on the first sort of step is, what do the laws in the country in which you gathered it say, rather than where you're sending it to. So to give an example, Saudi Arabia, there's been a lot of talk about its personal data protection rule. It's very restrictive on transferring any personal data out of the kingdom. So it's just it's a reminder that we all need to be connected in our big global family. We've all got clients across many jurisdictions, and it's very, very easy to trip yourself up.
Exactly. And I would say that to add on what you said, for European countries with GDPR, really there's that notion of safe harbor. So not only, of course, are you able to collect the data and what are you going to do with that, but if you're transferring it, you really need to show first that there's a necessity to transfer it, and you can't transfer it to any countries that would give at least the same level of care to that data that you would be doing. So that's the general principles, I would say.
Yeah, I'd like to add, especially for Japan or any other USA, they have lots of subsidiary in China, and China has a very restrictive data protection, especially for individual personal data protection regulations. So if you have some, age and also families and also social security numbers, you have to obtain the consent, especially for collecting data and also transfer to the headquarters to Japan or Europe. So I think that if the multinational companies have the subsidiary in China or some of the jurisdiction in Asia, most of the Asian country has a heavy protection of the personal data. That's why the headquarters are keen to that data transfer, especially for cross-border. In the clear acceptance is necessary. That's a key these days.
That was the last of our questions.
And I'm sure there are many more in store. So thank you so much for being available absolutely wonderful panelists. Thank you so much, Fred, for co-moderating this with me, and thank you, IPBA,
Thanks.
for doing this. And again, it's wonderful that all of you stayed on way past the hour to listen to everyone's views and thoughts. So thank you, and have a good rest of the day. Fred, do you have any announcements?
Oh no, I've done everything at the beginning, so no news from now. Or maybe the number of people registered to the Chicago conference has increased. We don't know. So we were at 400. We're gonna check. Thank you so much to all of you. Bye bye.
Thank you so much.
Okay, thank you. Happy
Bye-bye.
to join.
See you all in Chicago.
Yeah, see you.
See you in Chicago, absolutely. Bye
Bye.
bye.
Bye-bye.